Welcome to Created to Create Study Series Part 8. We're in the middle of the flood, the third event of the three events from Genesis 1 to 11. Remember, it's the creation, the fall, the flood, and nations. And we're in Genesis 8 at this point. In 7, the great fountains of the deep have opened up. We talked about Walt Brown's theory about how they actually escaped the gravitational pull, created comets. The study of comets, they're all giant chunks of ice, muddy water, if you will. Water doesn't really occur anywhere in our solar system except Earth. That's clue number 1. Clue number 2, all comets intersect Earth, some every 75 or 76 years, like Halley's Comet, some like the IKEA comet, 366 years. So we have comets that may only be seen once every 366 years, some every 76 years, and some on a much closer cycle to the Earth with 10, 12, 15 years. Hundreds of comets, however, and they all, according to Walt Brown's theory, were created on this day where the fountains of the deep had opened up. The Bible verse for the great fountains of the deep we talked about here, and it's in Genesis 7. And with regards to that, that's Genesis 7:11 through 13, and they're called the floodgates of heaven and the great springs or fountains of the deep. So, like a pressure cooker underwater, water superheated, subsurface, critical pressure, explodes, possibly created all radiation, which would cause us to live a shorter period of time. And Walt Brown also predicted that if we do find life on other planets, such as Mars, which they're digging up now, all it is exploded comets from the living matter created here. Also, when you do a carbon-14 dating test, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but everything looks good for about the last 6,000 years. It's pretty close because it counts a heavy carbon. Carbon actually weighs 14. It's an atom that should weigh 14. When they call it heavy, that means it's radioactive, and a carbon atom then weighs 14. So it's a little heavier than a normal atom. Any living matter, we call them a carbon-based unit, from a human being to a tree to any animal, has 1 out of a million heavy carbons in them. So if something died today, you would burn it, count the carbon atoms, and if there was 1 out of a million that were heavy, i.e. carbon-14, then you would know that it's died today or yesterday. Since the half-life of the radioactive carbon-14 is a little over 6,000 years, then if you were to find something that was 6,000 years old, you would find 1 out of 2 million carbon atoms now heavy, because half of them would have gone from heavy to normal. That's the half-life. So, using that as a time clock, it's very accurate to date things for the last 6,000 years. Once it gets past the 6,000 year mark, or the flood in this case, if there was no radiation, it throws the time clocks way off. So dating anything pre-flood, such as all the carbon fuels that we have, any kind of fossilized things that would have been buried during the flood time, will show up as typically millions and millions of years old, because there's no heavy carbon or carbon-14 in that. And that's simply because radioactivity might not have existed at that point, therefore allowing things to live very long. But of course, as a time clock, as we're using carbon-14, the assumption is that the same amount of carbon was made now as pre-flood, which I believe to be not true. So that just answers one of the scientific reasons that carbon-14 is no good prior to the flood, because there was no radioactivity. In fact, there's nothing really good about radioactivity, so we can conclude that when God created, in the six-day creation, created all things in the universe. When I say God, we talked about that Jesus was actually the creator. In Galatians 1:15, in John 1, in Isaiah 48:12 through 16, we find out Jesus, all things were created by Jesus and through Jesus. So Jesus is the creator of all things we see. God said it was good, and radiation is not good. It had to do with the fall of man and the judgment of man and the flood. So radiation produces death, decay, sickness, and so it's easy for us as Bible believers to realize that radiation would be along the same lines as poison, storms, cancer. These things were not in the original creation. These are part of a judgment from the fall of man. So now we're in the flood, and we pick up Genesis 8. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent the wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of heaven had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. The water receded steadily on the earth, and at the end of 150 days the water had gone down. And on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains. 17th day of the 7th month, the ark rested on the mountains. 17th day of the 7th month. So the 7th month in the Hebrew calendar was originally Nisan or Nisan. The 14th day of Nisan is the Passover. And when Moses, the very writer of this, when they exited, which is in Exodus obviously, they exited Egypt. That was the 10th plague, the plague that actually broke Pharaoh, where they painted the unblemished lamb blood on the doorpost on the 14th day of Nisan is when the animal was killed, the unblemished lamb, and the blood was put over the doorpost to allow the firstborn son to live. All you had to do is follow the instructions, and the blood would save that person's life physically. Then the Hebrew people, after 430 years of bondage, were allowed to leave. They, at that time, were instructed by God to change the Nisan from the 7th month to the 1st month. So now in today's calendar, Nisan is now the 1st month, but originally it was the 7th month. The reason these things are important is during the Passover supper for Jesus, when they celebrated Passover, that their days start at sundown. They were celebrating the Passover, and that ends up being the very day that Jesus was crucified, and his blood, the true unblemished lamb, died on the 14th day of Nisan, the same day as the Passover. Remember, again, the day starts at the PM, like we read through all the days from Genesis 1:1 to 2:3. Evening starts the day, and then daylight finishes the day. So what we would think is the next day when Jesus is crucified after the Passover, that's really the same 14th day of Nisan. It runs from approximately 6 p.m. That was the Passover feast. The next day, what we would call it, is still the 14th day of Nisan, and it doesn't end until 6 p.m. that night. So Jesus died the 14th day of Nisan, just like the Passover in the Moses time, about 1500 BC. And then here we are approximately 3200 BC, and on the 17th day of Nisan, or the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark is now landed on shore, saving the world physically. Again, Jesus died the 14th day, was in the grave or the tomb for 3 days, and rose 3 days later. So 3 plus 14 is the 17th day. I believe the first Easter morning was the 17th day of Nisan, and the world was saved spiritually on the 17th day of Nisan, Easter morning, when Jesus rose from the grave. I believe the world was saved physically on the 17th day of Nisan here in this scripture, which is Genesis 8. And let's see exactly what verse it is. It's 8:4. So this gives us a picture of Easter morning, physically saved on 3200 BC, but also as a picture that the world would all be physically saved. And when I say world, I mean world. The only 8 people that were alive, God provided for them on Easter morning. Now, God provides for all people, past, present, and future, on Easter morning, 17th day of Nisan, on the original Easter Sunday morning, which is 17th day of Nisan. And what a wonderful picture, because as we talked about in Hebrews, it turns out that the people in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew canon, who believed that the blood did atone for their sins, that was the best they understood, a substitutionary death. But when we're all in heaven, we're going to be worshiping Jesus, because they will have the full understanding that all of us in heaven will be worshiping the Lord, because it was his blood, not the oxen or goats, that took away their sin. And I just think that's a beautiful thing, that we'll be all there because of what the God of the universe came down and substituted his life and his blood so that we could live with him eternally. So he does grieve when we are not in obedience and loving him. And to know that how much he wants a relationship with us is really pretty incredible. So today, this concludes the Created to Create study series, part 8. We'll continue a little bit more with the end of the flood and go into Genesis 9 on the next study series. Thank you.